Hello, this is Anna Galetli, and we're going to do a quick overview of pain signaling looking at the spinal cord. We don't really go into this much in the lecture course. It's not really covered in your book very much, but it is something that we're going to hit on in Pathophysiology 1, and it's nice to have at least seen it once before you get it in Patho 1. Okay, so that's why I'm going over this. All right, so I've actually borrowed some pictures from a pathophysiology book to kind of go over the 4 steps in pain signaling. Now, there are a couple of different terms that you're going to memorize. We've got transduction, and what you'll see is I've got it over here, transduction, transmission, perception, and modulation. You'll see how they're numbered, okay? So the idea with the pain processing is what is the pathway it takes to get up to the brain? And then once you're at the brain, so brain is going to be where the perception is, are you going to leave it as is, or are you going to modulate it and change how you are transmitting that signal or perceiving that signal? Okay, so with transduction, the key terms I want you to remember, well, we've already talked about nociceptors. So that is the free nerve ending that's going to pick up painful information. So action potentials that are running along a sensory neuron that are communicating that there's a pain stimulus, okay? And like any other sensory information, you're dealing with altered membrane potential, okay? Now, sometimes we tend to get stuck on one type of pain sensation, often like trauma, like where you're cutting or tearing or pushing. And those would fall under the whole pressure type of pain stimulus. But there can also be pulling apart, like a tension. There can be heat, there can be cold, there can be chemical stimuli that causes sensations of pain, like excess potassium ions, histamines, those kinds of things, bradykinins and prostaglandins. Those are very important effectors of pain information, okay? So with transduction, this word means to transduce is to convert the sensory signal. And you're basically going to be converting it into a local potential. If the local potential is significant enough, then you will cause an action potential. If you get an action potential, you are now dealing with transmission. So let's talk a little bit more about transmission. All right, if you look at this picture here, you can see where I've got transmission here and here. And so remember, when we've talked about the neurons and how they get up to the brain, so they're going to come up here, they're going to go in through your spinal nerve, dorsal root, here's the ganglion, all right, they're coming into here, you've got the posterior horn. Now remember, these are going to cross over, and then they're going to ascend up to the brain. Okay, so that's why we've got transmission on 2 different places. So the first part of transmission is going to be the the peripheral nervous system, so outside of your spinal cord to the spinal cord. So how do you get it there, okay? And we have, there are more than one type of sensory neuron that we deal with, but the 2 that are most interesting for pathophysiology are the A deltas and the C fibers. And what's really interesting to me is that the C fibers are the most dominant, so 90%, but they also tend to be slow transmission because they tend to be unmyelinated, and they tend to be more of a dull or an ache. A delta fibers are myelinated, so they're fast, and they tend to be sharp, acute types of pain, okay? Then you've got the pathway from the spinal cord up to the brain, okay? And what we're going to be dealing with there is the release of substance P at the interneurons. So remember, this is where you're going to find those interneurons. Actually, over here in the dorsal horn is where they're going to synapse. I put the X in the wrong spot. So right here in the dorsal horn, okay, or the posterior horn, okay? And then they're going to synapse, cross over, or do the decussation, and then they're going to ascend up to the brain via the anterolateral tracts. So I think the next slide is talking about the actual perception at the brain. Let's see. Right, nope. Before we get on to the next thing, we're actually going to look in a little bit closer at the gray matter on a spinal cord that's been cross-sectioned. All right, and what I want to do is kind of just quickly review, all right, some of these ideas. Actually, it's probably not really review. It's probably new material. But again, you're going to get it in patho again. So you've got the pain being transmitted through this tract. So it can be called the anterolateral tract or the spinothalamic tract. That can technically be divided into the neospinothalamic and the paleospinothalamic. The paleospinothalamic is going to contain C fibers, and the neo is going to contain A deltas. What's interesting is that along the paleospinal tract, that means the transmissions are slower as they get up to the thalamus, and then they're going to go up to this area, the basal nuclei, the limbic system, and the somatosensory cortex. The neothalamic is going to have rapid transmissions because these fibers are myelinated, also going to thalamus and then to the somatosensory tract. What is cool is I want you to think about people who have chronic pain, and then chronic pain gets associated with depression. Notice that the limbic system is an important area where these pain sensations are being sent. And the limbic system is very important for emotions, but also for memory. So this is one of these interesting little connections that kind of helps to explain why chronic pain is going to be associated with so much depression, okay, and emotional upset. All right, so right here, you've got your spinal cord that goes into the dorsal root, and there's your ventral root, so we'll just do a V and a D. You've got your dorsal root ganglion. You've got these cute little cell bodies in there. Now notice what they've done in a dark purple is the A deltas, and then in a lighter color is the C fibers, and they're going to come into here. And what's neat is right here they've highlighted 3 lamina of the gray matter of the posterior horn. This is the substantia gelatinosa. And this is interesting because you've got multiple synaptic areas where you can do modulation of pain. So when we look at the modulation of pain pathway in a few slides, this is one, not the only, but one of the areas that they're targeting when your body decides to reduce how much pain is getting up to your brain. The other thing that's interesting right here is the tract of Lissauer. And basically you see these little thingies right here. This is kind of showing an extra synapse, and then they've got these little arrows to go up and down. So at the tract of Lissauer is where fibers can go up and down, where you don't necessarily have direct synapsing. All right, so they kind of go up a little bit and the spinal cord or go down a little bit. Now here you can see all the little interneurons and their synapses, and eventually these fibers are coming here and going over to here where you have the spinothalamic tract, and it's got the 2 little pathways that are going to go up to the brain. Okay, now also you're going to have convergence of somatic and visceral fibers in lamina 5, which is right here. So we've heard about referred pain. Well, where you've got these synapses, basically kind of like wires can get crossed, so that internal organ pain can be interpreted as pain in the skin or muscles, which is kind of interesting. Okay, so now that we've kind of reviewed this at a slightly deeper level, now we can go on and look at the next slide, at the next set of pictures. All right, so now we're at perception. And perception is where you're going to get up to the brain here. So we've got this labeled here. And you're going to be processing the sensations. And it's not controlled by one specific area. But it is where you become aware of it, you interpret it, figure out where it's located, the severity. And this is going to be primarily done up in the somatosensory cortex of your postcentral gyrus. Okay? But there are other areas involved, like the association area, the limbic system, the frontal lobe. Okay, so there's a lot of different things. Now I've got 2 definitions here that are interesting that you should know. Pain threshold versus pain tolerance. What's interesting to me is that pain threshold. So pain threshold is when you become aware that there's a pain sensation. When this is studied in a clinic or in the lab, what we find is that people tend to perceive that pain is present at the same level of pain. Okay, but what's different amongst people is pain tolerance. So pain tolerance is when in a clinical situation, they use when do you seek relief for that pain, where it's like when it's getting to be too much. This varies greatly between people, and it can also even be vary within a person. So, for example, when they've done studies with women prior to child labor and then during child labor, and women's pain tolerance goes up during child labor, so that they can take the pain a lot better than they would when they're not in labor. Okay. All right. I think we got one more slide and then we'll finish this. All right. Modulation may be one of the more interesting things, and you can do modulation up here in the diencephalon and in the brainstem. And in fact, I kind of mentioned that right here. But modulation can also occur in the spinal cord, and you can do modulation down at the sensory neuron and elsewhere in ganglia. Okay, so modulation is where you're going to be sending information in a descending pathway. All right, and its goal is to inhibit the transduction or the transmission. Okay, and again, multiple pathways along the area. Okay, so one of the areas where it does this, and this part's in the actual brain, is at the midbrain, where you've got periaqueductal gray matter. And in this area, we've got little neurons that pook out to two special areas called the rostral pons and the raphe magnus and the medulla oblongata. I know we really haven't studied that. You'll do this in patho. I just want you to be familiar with the words, okay? And there you're going to have interneurons that descend down to the spinal cord. Now you can secrete natural opiates, all right, natural opioids at interneurons where it will interrupt the synapses of the A delta and C fibers, basically blocking the transmission from one neuron to the next neuron, okay? One of the most famous neurotransmitters for this has a really stupid name called substance P. It sounds like it should be in a comic book. Anyway, substance P blocks the signal up there, okay? Plus, you've got natural opioids that block it. All right, so that was like a serious simplification of pain signaling and just a really brief introduction of what you're going to hit when you do pathophysiology. So I hope this kind of makes it make a little bit more sense. What's nice about the pain processing is any sensory information and motor information is following a very similar pathway where you've got transduction, then transmission, perception, and then some kind of action where it could be modulation or it could be an effect, like telling a muscle to contract or a gland to secrete. So then one of the things I like about going over the pain signaling is it's really modeling what you see with all of your neurons and all of these different pathways. And everybody likes to talk about pain, so it's all good. All right, so that was the end of the pain signaling, and you can stop and take a break.